Welcome back to Deck Check, where you better check yourself before you deck yourself. I'm Ganesh, and there's a ton of discussion flying around Nadu Winged Wisdom currently, mainly about how strong it is and especially on whether or not to clip its wings and ban the bird. I think it is the first card we've seen in a long time that may need a ban in cEDH. Now hold on, before you go to the comments and start angrily typing, hear me out. There's actually 5 big reasons why I think Nadu is very bad for the game overall. For those that are not familiar, Nadu Winged Wisdom is a 3 mana, so 1 green and blue, 3/4, bird wizard with flying, and creatures you control have, whenever this creature becomes a target of a spell or ability, reveal the top card of your library. If it's a land card, put it on the battlefield, otherwise put it in your hand. This ability triggers only twice each turn. Notably, each creature has that triggers only twice each turn clause, so each creature will be able to have this happen twice every turn. So first up, Nadu is one of the strongest early game engines we have ever seen in this game. For those that are not familiar with how this usually works, the deck will get a untapper like Seeker of Sky Breakout or a Pheto Alchemist, and then they will untap the creature itself. This will trigger Nadu, which will get you a card draw or a land drop on the battlefield, and you untap it twice, and then you can pass to the next person's turn and untap twice again. So this is actually super problematic. It can be because after one turn cycle, you are getting 8 essentially Thrasios activations. The closest thing we have to this effect in cEDH before Nadu was Seedworm Muse plus Thrasios, which was already like one of the strongest things in the game. If someone landed Seedworm plus Thrasios and they were able to protect it, they're almost assuredly winning the game. Another thing that makes this deck so strong is Nadu has a very low mana cost and he's in green, which makes getting him out easy and keeping him out very easy. You will almost always have Nadu out by turn 2, and on top of all this, this strategy is very consistent. The deck runs 15 dedicated untapper, like targeting abilities, so it's extremely easy to actually trigger this ability, and even a mediocre targeter is actually really good value in this deck. And when you think about the best case for blue farm, which would be having, say, Tymna and Crom both out on the battlefield, Tymna at best will draw you 3 cards a turn cycle, and usually Crom will trigger once or twice, which would be a total of 5 cards in the absolute best case scenario. Meanwhile, Nadu is over here with an untapper that can potentially draw 8. It's pretty crazy. This deck also can snowball very quickly and get really far ahead, which kind of brings us to our next point, that it's pretty unhealthy with the play patterns. This is one of the only cards in the game that can actually punish you for trying to remove it. So let's take 2 examples here, both using our trusty Swords to Plowshares. So let's say someone casts out a Nadu and they have some sort of targeter and you try to remove it. So you cast your swords on it, you're going to try to exile it. The first scenario, which is honestly what will probably happen a lot of the time, is the spell does resolve, but they do get their trigger off. And let's say it reveals a land card and they put it on the battlefield. Well, now if they were at 3 mana sources, now they're at 4, and on their next turn they can just play a land and get back up to 5 and recast Nadu, and you're almost back to where you started. Granted, it's a bit of a tempo loss for them, but still. The second example is you're casting your swords on Nadu and they actually happen to have a counterspell, which of course the deck is absolutely packed with interaction to stop you from killing Nadu because it's so good. Let's say they Fierce Guardianship. Well, now you've traded 1 for 1, and not even really that, because you've gone down on card advantage and they haven't, because they get a Nadu trigger, they're going to draw a card or get a land. In addition, this deck has a large amount of triggers. So not only if they get one of these untappers out, these specific ones, they also have things like Spellskite and Sylvan Safekeeper, Unctus, and Shuko, things that will just trigger this a lot of the times. And for those that aren't familiar with how priority works, this is going to create a new round of priority in response to each target and each trigger. You can shortcut this a little bit in IRL games, but the point remains that it is just miserable to have to sit there and play against all of these different triggers. And on top of that, the deck's win conditions are very convoluted. There's like landfall stuff. I'm not going to get into it too much. Now say what you will about Thoracle, but at the very least with Thoracle, it's very simple to know the game's over. This deck has to spin its wheels a lot some of the time to just even end the game, which is not really fun for the other players. And you can even have situations where the Nadu player is ahead enormously in value, but they can't actually end the game, so they have to pass the turn and sit there and do even more triggers, which makes things take even longer. And on top of that, this problem is just exacerbated if you have 2 Nadus in the same pod, or even 3 or 4. The game is just going to take forever because of all of these priority passes and all of these triggers. The next point I'd like to bring up about the deck is it doesn't have to make a lot of deck sacrifices actually to make this work. Now you would think normally a deck that relies on high synergy to win has to make some sacrifices in card quality to make the deck function. An extreme example of this would be Anya Falconwrath filling their deck with Madness cards so they can draw 2 World Gorger Dragon faster. This isn't exactly the case with Nadu. Most of the cards in this deck are just good in general or have a very small cost. For example, Spellskite is a targeter that will trigger Nadu, but it's just a good card overall. March of Smirling Mist is a very good card, and that also will trigger Nadu a lot. They are running a couple of dead cards. For example, Sylvan Paradise and Sway of Illusion, as well as Shuko. But those are in the minority. The majority of cards that target are already good cards, like Paradise Mantle, Conqueror's Flail, Lightning Greaves, even Minamo, which has some synergy with the One Ring if you're running that. So overall, the deck has so much synergy, and they're not really sacrificing a lot in terms of card quality to get their deck going. Next thing I'd like to bring up is the deck can be very difficult to interact with. This is creature based, so it's difficult to counterspell. Like, let's say they play out an Effetto on turn 1 or 2, and they follow it up with a Nadu. It's very, very difficult to stop them from casting out these creatures. As we all know, most of the good counterspells in cEDH are focused on non-creatures. For example, Fierce Guardianship is a non-creature. Force Navigation is a non-creature. A lot of the spells that we play that are efficient, that stop things, only hit non-creature spells. Granted, you can still Force of Will and Mindbreak trap it, but those are just going to be a bit less plentiful than non-creature counterspells are going to be. We did just get one with the Strict Serenade, but the point remains. The deck also just happens to run a lot of cheap interaction, like we talked earlier. There's a Spellskite, there's all sorts of cheap, like Mental Misstep, Miscast, that sort of thing, to just keep Nadu alive. So it can be hard to get it off the board once it's on there. And on top of that, if you do try to remove it, regardless of what happens, they're at minimum getting a trigger, which can let them recast Nadu later, or at the very least be a card draw. With all this said, I think this commander will have a negative effect on the meta. This value engine can be so powerful, it will force the players in the pod to either have to race it, like turbo out, before they can develop, or losing to the absurd value that it provides. Now, this may not be a 100% accurate prediction, but something that's possible is the meta will be split even further into either decks that can out-turbo Nadu and end the game before it can do anything, or you can run a value deck, for example, Traxa or Timna Thrasios or Tevishkrom, any number of these mid-range value-ish deck, and you can run more anti-Nadu cards, but that in turn will make you more weak to turbo decks that just don't really care about their creatures. For example, if you would like to target Nadu and you put in, say, a Dress Down or some other more forms of creature removal spells, well, now your matchup against turbo decks is awful, because a lot of times a deck like Rogside is just trying to care about resolving ad nauseum. They don't care if you kill one of their creatures, they will win regardless of whether or not that happens. So take all this with a grain of salt. There is no way to know for sure if all of this will come true, if not, it will have this much of an impact on the meta. It's very possible we will find very good answers to it and everything will be fine, but I remain a little bit doubtful. So these are just my thoughts on it. Please let me know what you think in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe. Maybe send this video to a friend. Thank you.